And good evening and welcome to Husband's Hour. Well, in the red corner from the newsroom, Hunter Andrews, ladies and gentlemen. And in the blue corner, the traditional blue corner, Willie the Warrior, aka Bill English, Leader of the Opposition. Good evening, Bill.
Good evening, John.
Nice to have you here. On TV the other night, prisoners in the Manawatu were filmed making a CD of love songs. I wonder how their long-forgotten victims felt watching this warm, fuzzy Peter Williams QC PR exercise. God, that made me want to vomit. However, surprise, surprise, the United States Catholic hierarchy is to ban pedophiles from their clergy. Well, I suppose someone was surprised about that. I certainly wasn't. And Senior Sergeant Mark Richards is on the internet and also on full pay. Who is Senior Sergeant Mark Richards? Oh, it doesn't really matter, but he's getting enough publicity, isn't he? Way up there among the hierarchy of the police. Well, Bill, one would be excused if one would say to you, ho-hum, it's election time. But this is not going to be a ho-hum election, is it? Because it has all twists and turns. A lot ahead for you in particular.
Oh, it has, John, particularly with the way that voters are trying to figure out what this election's about. And you've got people changing their minds every day. The campaign hasn't even started officially yet. That's another couple of weeks away. But in the end, it's going to sort itself out as an old-fashioned election between National and Labour. Labour and the Greens, National and ACT if they're there. At the moment, the government's trying to make it Labour versus the Greens. I actually think they're working together to get their own publicity up. Someone
didn't tell Winston Peters though, did they?
No.
He was in full flight with the same rhetoric last night in particular. I was watching, and I could just about lip sync the whole lot.
And probably the same crowd that he's had there for 10 years or so in Tauranga.
I mean, Winston's older though, Bill.
3 years older.
Yes.
He stopped dyeing every sort of little bit. He stopped dyeing a little bit of the front of his hair. I've noticed too. So he's getting that grey look.
Yeah. Well, Winston's got a predictable market in Tauranga who love him. It's just that it's a lot smaller than it used to be, and he's trying to get in there. I mean, Winston can only get there if he takes some votes out of Labour.
But don't take him for granted, Bill.
Oh,
he's
no,
we're
not taking him for granted. I mean, we've got a good candidate in Tauranga to give him a good hard run in the electorate. Winston's trying to take votes out of Helen as well, because that's how he can make himself the kingmaker. I had a chat with him a few weeks ago, and he definitely sees himself as rerunning that nightmare we had in 1996, you know, where Winston went fishing the day after the election while he decided who was going to be the government.
Looking back on that time, though, would you have rather that Labour had ended up with Winston Peters?
Oh no, winning's always better.
This would be your
winning's
election.
Always better.
This would be your election, though, wouldn't it?
Winning is always better. I mean,
at what cost, though?
Well, you can argue in hindsight that the cost was too high. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't.
For National's credibility, anyway.
Well, we ran into a lot of trouble anyway, not just because of Winston, but because we were getting disconnected from the community and from their concerns. And this election is about our opportunity to rebuild that.
So can you expect that after 9 years then, that a party will become disconnected with the community?
Well, it did happen, and I think if you're in government for 9 years, you get to rely too much on the government. There was also an awful lot of change went on in the 90s. We changed the electoral system, the economic system, changed a whole lot of things. So people get tired of it. But so we have set out to make the changes the public expect to see us make. And that's with new candidates, a new approach, new leader, and that's why we're going to do well in this election.
Valuable lesson learned. You weren't listening after 9 years.
And you told me that too, John.
Indeed. But, I mean, a lot of other people would tell you. You didn't have to be Einstein to tell you that you had become totally disconnected with the people you were supposed to be representing. And that goes for a lot of the politicians in government or out of government. Before we go any further, though, what did Mum have to say about the boxing business, Bill?
Now, you mean my own mother?
Your own mum.
My own mum. Yes. Well, she was pretty concerned about it, to be honest.
I would say she should have been too.
She should have been.
I was a bit concerned about it.
But I just told her about the hard physical upbringing that she'd given me, that it equipped me well for going in the boxing ring. Getting out, milking the cows, 6:30 on a Southland winter's morning.
Yeah, when you went over the
weekend. That toughens you up. This is when I was a wee boy.
I see.
10 years old.
Okay, barefoot to school, through the frost.
No, we used to bike in the frost, 4 miles in the frost, no gloves,
So you should have. Yes.
Not with no hats. So that's why she worried about it. Yeah, she did worry about it.
I had to clear that one up.
Yeah.
Is Mallard an embarrassment to the Prime Minister just now?
Well, he is, and she should be taking a lot more notice of what is going on with the teachers and the kids. I mean, it doesn't really matter now what deal they come up with. The teachers are going to turn it down because they are so bitter about Mallard. And the problem there is that he raised their expectations so high. I mean, these guys were getting standing ovations from secondary teachers before the last election. They thought, get rid of National, this will fix everything.
Is it Mallard or the PPTA though? It looks like a lot of teachers that I've spoken to in the last 5 years even have expressed concerns at the PPTA and the upper levels of the PPTA. I mean, is it a war between the government and teachers, or teachers and their own administration, their own union?
Look, they're all warring with each other in a way. It doesn't matter. What it needs is some leadership to get it through. The secondary kids have only got 16 weeks left of school. They get one shot this year at sixth form or fifth form or fourth form, and particularly for the fifth formers, it's turning into a real mess. And I just don't see any sign from Helen Clark or Labor that they understand what it's like for the kids and the parents. They're going to try and cobble together some political deal before the election, probably, if the teachers let them. But you know, you don't want to underestimate just how bitter and resentful the teachers are.
So what would National do then?
Well, we're going to talk about that tomorrow. I'll be making some announcements in Wellington. But basically there's a couple of things you have to do. One is you do have to meet the market. The teachers, particularly the third, fifth year, sixth year teachers, have got choices. They can go off and get better pay doing other jobs. And it's just like looking for fitters and turners in Invercargill. You've got to pay to get them. And secondly, they need a lot more flexibility.
So is pay parity the issue with a lot of primary teachers? A lot of secondary teachers say that they have degrees, they work a lot harder than primary teachers. It seems to be a real bugbear with them that they are now paid the same.
Well, it's going to get worse because on the 1st of July, kindergarten teachers come into pay parity as well. Look, you've got to treat each of these groups on their merits. Primary teachers deserved better pay, and they got that in a couple of years back. They caught up. The secondary teachers have now got a particular set of problems. Just remember, the kids are more important than the system. We've got to get teachers in front of those kids, and enthusiastic teachers, because that makes a huge difference too.
We'll come back to that in just a moment. We're going to take a break now and back with Husband's Hour and my esteemed guests in the studio, Hunter Andrews from the newsroom and Bill English, the leader of the opposition. And before we get off the subject of education, Bill, and the present impasse between PPTA, it seems to me, as Hunter suggested, between PPTA and their own members, but there's a lot of money to be found. Would you be able to find that money that these teachers are demanding?
I don't think they're demanding a whole lot more. We will have to find the money or there won't be a settlement.
We're about 10 mil short.
And there won't be teachers in the classrooms. And you don't have a whole lot of choice about this. We've got to get real. Well, I'm speaking as a parent, right? Yep. With 5 children in the education system, 1 in secondary school, and a lot of parents are getting angry and very irritated that no one seems to be taking the action that you need to take to get the teachers in front of the classrooms. That's pretty basic.
But I think PPTA, the bureaucracy in the PPTA needs to be looked at very closely and perhaps given a bit of a wake up. Get your act together before you go to the bargaining table with Mr. Mallard or whoever happens to be there. Let's come back to some local stuff here. I see you congratulating the consortium on the bid for the power generation and lines and so forth. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't make too many friends among the Alan Swallows and the Max Skerritts of this world, would you?
Well, because it's always been a bit hard to make friends with Alan.
But there's still a lot of...
I'm not the only one who's had that trouble, John.
Well, join the club.
You used to have a bit of trouble yourself, didn't you?
I've had more than my share of trouble. But bless them, good evening to you out there. But I can't help thinking that there are a lot of people, a lot of ratepayers out there, rather nervous. Why did you think this was such a good deal when so many other people are saying, hey, it's not a goer. How the hell are we going to pay for this?
Well, they've made it, there's a trade-off here. If Dunedin had bought the South Otago power, it would have left us pretty isolated, and in the end, with some outside ownership that could easily have messed around with our power prices over a long time. We would have been vulnerable. Now we are the bigger player, and they are the ones who are in a bit of a corner, and we can end up being a big player in South Island electricity. Now the difficulty is that the potential problem is just the one you've raised, and that is that the consumers end up paying too much for their power to pay for these deals, and the power company is going to have to be very, very careful about that.
Have you had any regrets about letting Max Bradford off the chain all those years ago?
Well,
it was a monumental cock-up, wasn't it? It didn't work.
Well, the test of it has been with Labor coming in. They came in, campaigned against the electricity changes. They've spent millions.
What did you think about the electricity changes, personally?
Well, I thought they were okay. But I know politically it was a huge problem, and some parts of the country really bad. So Labor's had a good hard look at it. They spent millions reviewing it, and actually haven't changed much, which surprised me, because I thought, look, new government coming in, it's been controversial.
It's settled down, hasn't it? Do you think it's settled down since, what was it, 98 or?
Well, in the end, the problem is still going to be, how do you make sure the lines companies don't rip off the consumers? And in most cases it's local ownership, so even if they charge them too much, they end up having to give the money back.
At least I guess the government did separate the lines from the generators and that sort of thing, not like telecom when everything was sold.
Well, that's the point there, where in telecom they're trying to do some of the same things as were done in electricity. I mean, the decision was made. The government has left it pretty much intact, and now we've got to make sure that there's enough rules there to ensure the line companies can't get carried away.
So you're relatively comfortable with it?
Well, I don't think there's any way you can undo it. I'm just practical about it, John.
Okay, agriculture remains the hub of the economy. And I'm quoting from your press releases, of which I've been inundated lately. Will deliver the reduced farm business costs as well as fostering innovation and added value. There's not very much here to say how you're going to do that.
Yes, well, if you go through the list, there's a number of quite specific proposals there.
Well, you're quoting the problems that are facing Jim Sutton. ACC rates, petrol tax, road user charges, and the proposed Kyoto research tax. Kyoto's are way off. The petrol tax didn't have a hell of a lot to do with the government, did it?
Oh yes, it did. Yeah, the specific measures we've proposed are to make ACC competitive, because farmers' ACC levies have gone up 40%, 40, not 14, 40.
And what do you, in the private sector, I mean, this is one of the fundamental differences, isn't it, between Labor and National, that Labor believes the government can do it and you believe the private sector can do it. How cheap do you think they'd be if the private sector, after a number of years, had been competing?
Well, the farmers were very happy with the competition in ACC, because they finally got insurers who understood self-employed. I mean, one of the most regular constituent cases I get is a farmer who's paid his levies and then has a lot of trouble getting ACC when something goes wrong on the farm to cover the costs. So they're starting to get deals that made sense for farmers rather than being bundled in with everyone else.
So has it been a big problem for Labor though?
It's been a problem for the farmers. I don't think Labor would care too much about it. They just keep sticking up the levy rates. The Kyoto Protocol is another one where there's quite different views. We're saying don't sign up to it ahead of our trading partners.
And Australia's asserted that it won't either. So.
Australia's said it won't, the US has said it won't, the government has said it will.
Do the public relate to that sort of thing though, such as a carbon tax and that sort of thing? Do people really understand? Is it really an election issue that is a populist issue that people can embrace and identify with? No,
it's not populist. This is specific policy around the farming community, and the farming community certainly does understand about Kyoto, about ACC, about the petrol tax, about the Resource Management Act.
But these fundamental differences aren't really differences that people on the street relate to though, are they, between National and Labor? Has there been the middle ground? A lot of commentators are saying the middle ground, National and Labor, really are quite similar. They're both pursuing free trade overseas, trade agreements, that sort of thing. What are the real differences that people identify with? That you'll be saying we are different because...
Yep. Well, I'm pleased Labor are agreeing with sensible policy like free trade. That's good. but we disagree on pretty fundamental issues. They want higher taxes, we want lower taxes. I mean, you can't get much more difference.
But the last election really was a vote for higher taxes, wasn't it? People said, look, if we want to fix these problems, then you're going to have to pay 3 cents more or more in the dollar. And people voted to do that.
They did, and that's precisely why it'll be an issue again, because they paid the higher taxes, and the government has just ordered the local district health board to cut health services. Paid your taxes, where's the services?
Got a new hospital for Wellington, and possibly a new one here.
They paid, yeah, but the services are going to be cut. It's in the budget. They directed 120 million health cuts across the country. Paid higher taxes and can't get teachers in the classroom. That's puzzling people. So we have taken the big step of saying we're going to lower taxes, because these good times won't keep going unless the government gets in behind the businesses and the farmers to keep them going. So we've got a long-term plan for that, and Labor are just going to keep putting taxes up, and no one can quite understand why that means. Why with more tax, the health services are going to be cut, and the teachers can't be paid enough to get them in the classroom.
Well, we've got to take a break now, but we will carry on along that general theme after the break. And back with my special guest tonight, Bill English, Leader of the Opposition and one-time pugilist. I hope he'll forget that. I'm trying to forget it, for heaven's sake. Just before we get off the subject of taxation, whether to tax or not to tax, I think that the fundamental that we've got to remember as taxpayers, that it costs a lot of money to live in this real world that we're trying to compete with. A whole lot more money than the average voter would believe. And you can't have this kind of progress and this kind of world recognition and trade unless you're prepared to pay. Would you agree or not agree on that?
Well, you've got to be prepared to pay some tax, absolutely, because there's a lot of people who need support.
So why cut the taxes then?
Well, the big difference behind our tax plans is Labor are planning to take a couple of billion of the tax dollars from the families and businesses of Invercargill and Southland, put them in a fund, a savings fund, and invest most of that overseas. So they need to collect a couple of billion more each year in order to feed this fund and then feed the US economy.
Isn't that better than doing nothing about superannuation, to which you're alluding? Doing nothing at all, election after election.
No, it isn't. It's worse than doing nothing, because we need to invest that in New Zealand. That money should be staying here to build the Southland economy further and faster, rather than going to the US to build the economy in New York. That just doesn't make any sense to me.
We have an excellent community trust here that does invest a lot overseas and returns great things.
The bulk of my personal investments are overseas. I'm taking guidance from my fund manager, and virtually nothing, very, very small percentage of my money is invested in New Zealand.
Yeah, and that's the same thing, the same rules that this fund would follow. And that's the difference between the country and you. You are saving up for your own retirement, but New Zealand has a much wider obligation than that. The New Zealand government has to educate its young. It's got to back its businesses. It's got to develop a future that's going to give our young people a sense of opportunity, or they will go. If we were just a savings bank, then it would be fine. But we're not. We're a nation, and we can't give away the choices of a generation by hogging all the tax to invest overseas when we could leave it here in the South. The people here in the South will do a better job than the fat bankers of Wall Street at turning that money into benefit for New Zealand.
Southlanders have asked for virtually none of the expansion money, the money on offer, a very small percentage from your own press release.
That's right.
Because why, Bill? Why haven't
because
they
been doing well, and because they know
exactly.
We all know that if we back ourselves, we get there. If we hang around waiting for the government handout, it's not going to happen, and it's not going to stick. So I'm proud of that, in a way.
But you made a bit of a meal of it. I mean, there's that money you were saying in your press release is there. You know, come and get a handful of it, and get yourself organised. Well, obviously they're well enough organised in this part of the world to disregard that.
Yes, they are. That's right. And I was really surprised. I was surprised to see the figures.
Okay. National's rural health policy. I mean, this is the same old, isn't it? The law and order, the health, and
Well, that's because they still matter, John. It still matters whether you have a doctor. It mattered last election. It matters this election.
But little communities, Bill, are getting out and doing it for themselves.
They have, but the goalposts keep shifting, and I've been closely involved with this for the last 10 years, 12 years in the province. And the things you had to do 10 years ago to get a doctor worked then, they don't work now.
Why don't they work?
Because I think it's because the expectations of the doctors have changed. So 10 years ago, the job was to make sure when a doctor came to Tuatapere, they didn't have to put money in. They didn't have to buy the practice. So the locals own the practice, as they do in Lumsden, for instance, and a
Tuatapere, Riverton.
They all own the locals own the practices. So the doctor can just walk in and do the business. Well, now the doctors all expect that. They expect to come without having to put their capital in. But now they are concerned about the call. They don't want to have to do the call. 5 years ago, they were worried about locums, so there's been some locum schemes started up to give them some time off. That's reasonable. But the younger doctors now don't want to have to do what the doctor in Lumsden does, which is he's on every second night, or in Gore every fourth or fifth night. So now we've got to find a way of making that easier so we can get the doctor.
So what was different 20 years ago when the profitability was in the rural sector? Why were there doctors? What's different now?
I think it's to do with the people who are coming through from medical school. It's now virtually impossible.
Student loans, you mean? Or?
Well, no, they're just different social expectations. It's virtually impossible now to get a younger New Zealand doctor and their spouse to come to a rural area.
Is that because they're not coming from rural areas themselves?
Now, that is one of the issues. And there's two things we can do in the long run. One has started up 2 or 3 years ago, where the medical students come in their 5th year to Gore in Balclutha. And you can imagine what it's like telling them their mates, I'm off to Gore for 6 weeks. But when they come, they really like it. They find it's much more interesting than they thought. The other thing we need to do is what they're doing in Australia, and that is recruit medical students from rural areas, because they're much more likely to go back. The fact is that, say, if you're recruiting the kids from the top of the big urban secondary schools into medical school, they're not thinking about going to rural areas.
What are they thinking of then? When they're going into medicine, what are they thinking of? The bright lights. When I've graduated, it's the bright lights for me, baby, and the big money.
That's right.
Are we not running a risk of getting second best doctors into these country practices because nobody else wants it?
We are running that risk. It's why we need to make them attractive, so we've got a choice about which doctors come.
How much more attractive can you get than a house and a clinic?
Well, the next thing is the call, and then there's some problems you can't solve. So if a doctor comes with a spouse or a partner, you can't, and they want a job, you can't necessarily meet that requirement.
It appears that the doctor's got the problem then.
Well, no, we've got the problem.
Attitude.
We've got the problem, which is we need the doctors more than the doctors need us in the rural areas.
Indeed.
So that's why we've just got to keep moving to make it attractive. And to the credit of the small communities around Southland, they've done an awful lot in the last 10 years to make that doable.
We had no option.
Exactly, and now the problem exists in Gore and in Invercargill, and we've got no option other than to make them more attractive. So we put in, I think, 12 million over the next 3 years, or 15 million, and the idea there is that the District Health Board can put in more money for the income, say, right, we're going to put another $50,000 in if you come, or it can offer to discount the student loan for a younger doctor. Or it can help pay the expenses for an overseas doctor to get here.
I thought that we'd got past SMPs, Bill. I really thought we'd got
we
past
haven't, John. We haven't.
Subsidisation.
It's just different people getting them. Well, we need the doctors. You don't have any choice. You need the doctors. You need the emergency services. You need the police. You need the teachers.
We're over a barrel. We've got to take another break now. We're back with my guests in just a moment. Back with Husband's Hour, Bill English and Hunter Andrews, my guests tonight. The runway extension is vital for Southland, so says Bill English. Support from Wellington is crucial in ensuring this project goes ahead. Now, we discussed this last week on the show, Bill, Hunter and I, and a money manager. And I also discussed it with the CEO of the Invercargill Licensing Trust privately, and he said unless there's a firm infrastructure and a commitment to a scheduled service, not a wet or dry charter, but a scheduled service, there's no point in even thinking about funding an extension to the runway. There's no way that the airline will give us a scheduled service, just as simple as that.
Mm.
Well, are you aware of how powerful these airlines are?
I am, yep. And that's a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? They're not going to give you the service if there isn't the runway there, and it's hard to justify the funding for the runway if you haven't got a scheduled service locked in.
I mean, the CEO of the Invercargill Licensing Trust, his very organisation relies to a large extent on people who are brought in and out by aeroplanes.
Mm. Mm.
And he's as anxious as anybody to get cargo shifted and people shifted and perhaps a jet service here. But we are not going to get that unless we can get their arm firmly up their back and say, what about a scheduled service? Once a week, twice a week?
Surely the growth down here, though, will mean that it will inevitably happen. I mean, tourism in itself is going to attract more planes.
The best thing that's happening,
one would have thought so.
Yeah, the best thing that's happening at the moment is this news about how they're going to try and reduce the airfares, because I think the ILT, like a number of others, were getting really concerned about the cost of getting to Invercargill. And I come across groups up north who would say, look, we know you've got great facilities down there, but we can't afford to go there. And Air New Zealand have...
What's the reasons for not being able to afford?
Oh, just because those airfares have got so high. And Air New Zealand are now planning this essentially cut-price domestic airline. They're saying they're going to reduce fares by up to 30%, and that would be good news for us. We just got to make sure it happens on the leg from Christchurch to Invercargill, not just on Christchurch, Auckland, Wellington. Okay,
go back to your press release here. How much influence would you have, or any politician have, with an airline?
Oh, not a lot directly, to be honest. They run, Air New Zealand are meant to run on a tight commercial process. They will only make moves in this respect if they think there's going to be some big gain for them. So that's exactly the challenge.
But we want them to make money because there's now...
Because you own it.
Because we own it,
yeah. Yeah, well, this is why it's an issue about local support, because you're not going to get the commitment if you don't have the runway capacity. Now, a year or so ago, the councils had a list of priorities about projects they thought should be shuffled to the front of the queue for the regional development cash. Now, one of those was the hump track. It got a big lump of cash, probably needs a bit more actually, so that they can upgrade the wet spots. The next one on the list was the airport extension. So I just want to prod the local bodies a bit as to whether they still see that as the top priority around which they can all support.
Unfortunately, we have a city mayor that spent rather a lot of money on the airport a number of years ago, and I think he's a bit living that down, still living that.
Well, that's right. It's a project that's had its own twists and turns.
But at least we've got a customs hall.
Oh, that's
haven't
right,
we? We have it all there.
Ready to go.
One day.
Well, you may well laugh, but I mean, things like that have happened before, haven't they? And thank God Shadbolt did that.
That's right.
10 years ago.
History often judges us politicians much better later on than it does at the time.
When he's back on the well, here it has a very bad habit of repeating itself, but when he's back on the concrete mixture, they're going to...
They say nice things about you once you leave.
Indeed, yes. It's like an obituary.
That's how you've been through that.
Last week.
You were a terrific radio host, John.
Yeah, I wish you'd said that while I was there. Now, the other hoary old chestnut, law and order, Bill.
Okay, now this is serious. This isn't just a hoary chestnut, John. Back in the 1999 election, a whole 92% of New Zealanders voted on the Norm Withers referendum for action on crime. Now, it was a pretty general statement.
Fairly non-specific.
A bit non-specific, but it did certainly included statements about sentencing. Now, what has happened since then is way out of line with public expectations. Since then, Labor have passed a law just a couple of months ago that says a serious violent criminal can be eligible for parole after 1/3 of their sentence. So a rapist gets 9 years, after 1/3 could be eligible for parole. Now, when you tell the public they'll tell you it's exactly the opposite of what they're after.
But
we shouldn't be reducing the sentences that violent criminals will be serving.
Surely we trust our parole boards and that sort of thing, in that sort of circumstance, not to release some. Surely there's faith in that side of the justice system that wouldn't release a rapist after 3 years.
But you're sitting there as the judge or the parole board and you're saying to yourself, this is a signal from Parliament. We believe that everyone who commits a serious offence should serve 2/3 of their sentence before they're eligible for parole. Some go further. I get told at public meetings, why have parole at all? Well, I think there is a role for an incentive for prisoners for good behaviour and to give them the opportunity to change their ways and get them used to going back out into the community, because after all, all prisoners end up back out in the community. So we should have parole, but they should serve 2/3 of the sentence. Otherwise, the sentence doesn't mean anything.
What about this new legislation? I believe it's at its first reading stage, the 10 years without another conviction after a minor conviction. Do you think that people deserve a second chance? Or
the clean slate bill? Yeah, you can see the justice or the injustice in someone having their whole life affected by a minor conviction.
When they were 16 or 17, wanting to join the police in their mid-30s, a totally different person, still inhibited by a conviction.
Yeah, you just have to be very careful about where you draw the line so that you're not sending the signal that offending doesn't matter. So that's the argument. The argument is about where you draw the line.
So a little harder at one end, National is, and perhaps to give at the other end. What about home detention?
Yeah, we supported home detention. We brought it in. It sounds like from the paper that John was talking about, some of the prisoners are feeling pretty much at home in the prison, making their own CDs of love songs.
We're talking about a very small percentage of really violent people. Why not keep them well and truly banged up for a long time? Because as you say, the majority of them get out of jail and hopefully lead sort of meaningful lives. But the small percentage are the ones who are getting up the nose of the public. But this has been going on for so long, Bill. You conveniently forgot the 300,000 people who put their name to the Kylie Smith petition. That was totally ignored. I mean, okay, the government ignored the Withers, but the government also ignored the Kylie Smith petition. 300,000 signatures. What the hell do you have to do to get you guys to listen?
Well, we are listening.
Are you afraid of the judiciary?
You're saying it's a hoary old chestnut. I mean, we are moving to toughen the sentences. Life means life for the worst. Moving the non-parole period for murder from 10 to 15 years, because we value lives, and people taking them recklessly and randomly should get a very stiff sentence. And violent criminals have to serve 2/3 of their sentence, not 1/3 as under Labor. That is the message that's coming from the public, and we're acting on it, and that's why those policies have such broad support.
It moves exceeding slow. We'll be back in a moment with more from Bill English. So we're going to stay on the theme of law and order, crime and or evil. Bill, I continually hear from politicians that they cannot and will not influence or dictate to the judiciary. That's a hard word. Are you afraid of the judges and the magistrates and the like? Because you could really take them by the scruff of the neck and say, hey, let's get this sorted, fellas. Have you got to put more words into the statutes to do that? Explain to me why it cannot be done.
Well, it can be done, and it is being done. You've seen over the last 10 years quite big changes in sentencing for rape and other violent crime, for domestic violence, with the police taking it seriously. We're proposing another move with respect to murder and parole, and life means life. So the judiciary, the judiciary have to work on their own with the cases they've got, and they have to apply justice consistently, not depending on whether it's a big case in the media or a small case. What the Parliament can do is show a lead by moving the benchmarks, and that's what we're doing.
Okay, I've always been the opinion, as I've grown older, I've been of the opinion that you're attacking this from the wrong end. We are breeding criminals like no one's business. We have been feeding the habit of people who are not particularly fussed about contributing to our national wealth and health. We've paid them to stay at home. We've paid them almost to be criminals. We've paid them to become dysfunctional. The very essence of the family group, whether it's a solo mother or a solo father or whatever, they need not be dysfunctional. If somebody is there looking over their shoulder and steering them from the day the child comes off the breast, surely that's not too difficult to understand, because that's where it's happening. If we went back to that and started there, you may not be breeding so many total losers.
But isn't that more a result of the economic circumstance in the last 15 years than...
We've never had it so good, though, as one politician
many years ago. A lot of people down here made a lot of good money up until about 10 years ago, and jobs suddenly disappeared. They were taking home $700-800 a week working in the meat industry and that sort of thing. Suddenly it's not there. That has an impact on families, a dramatic impact, doesn't it?
Why did they have to be so utterly dysfunctional, so socially catastrophic?
Well, some people just don't know any better. You're cutting to the core of the argument about welfare and about how much people need to do for themselves and how much the government can do for them. Now, the government can't be a parent. You can't make the Minister of Social Welfare the father in all those homes. But there are things you can do, and particularly for those that really are dysfunctional. Just remember, a lot of solo parent households actually function okay. My kids go to school. The majority of them do. The majority of them do. These are the schoolmates of my children, and it's pretty hard for the mothers, but they do a remarkably good job on low incomes without much support. So what you can do, though, is get right in alongside those that are really dysfunctional. Now, there's a program called Family Start that we brought in, which I believe should be spread further around the country. And what it does is it starts with the teenage mother. Basically, if you've got a woman having a baby who is under 20 and has changed addresses a couple of times in the last 12 months, they're almost certainly going to have a whole lot of other problems. Probably something to do with addiction of some sort or violent relationships. There's a collection of those problems that show up if they that are shown up by the fact they keep shifting around. This is operating in a number of places around New Zealand, and really successful. And really successful.
Very well indeed here, as you know.
It's a bit like the old style Karatani nurse, who's alongside that person, one person from the government who's a support instead of a lineup of cars outside from different agencies. And more, if you just pick up the ones who really need that support, you can change the cycle.
The government played around with the Plunket's free line, a free phone line, and reluctantly, when it was brought to their notice that it was an integral part of some young mother's life, be able to call the Plunket nurse. That's the kind of help I'm envisaging. There's more of those people watching for these people at risk. You know about parenting. I sort of knew about parenting. You never become very qualified.
I'm still learning, John. Don't worry.
You're right.
The good thing is I'm getting lessons from my kids now. I used to just have to make it up by myself, but now they're telling me how to do it.
Thank God that you've got some kids who are going to give you some lessons, Bill. All is not lost then.
No, it isn't.
But to be serious, if we can stop these young people becoming the ratbags that they are, purely and simply because they know no different. They've got a pretty wobbly household, boyfriends coming and going, substance abuse, the whole bit. I know it's not a big percentage, but that is the breeding ground of these people who are fronting up in court. Stand at the newsroom window at Mercury Television on a Tuesday, mate, and there it's all. The passing parade is there.
Can I tell you about something I saw the other day that gives me a lot of hope about this? I've spent a bit of time lately working around issues with younger people, partly because as a parent I face another 15 years of teenagers, But also...
Doesn't stop there, Bill.
Oh, okay.
Believe me, I know.
Well, that's just my next goalpost, right? My next signpost. But I went to Fielding, a place about the size of Gore, and there they've got a youth offending board, which essentially works with the police. The police pick up a kid who's done some minor offence, and they send them as part of the diversion to this board. And it's a community group with one full-time person who looks after the kids. And they're dealing with about 50 offenders a year, and they have had something like one person re-offend from last year. And it's just good old-fashioned community pressure and community solutions. So they get the victim in, they get the parents in. It's all so simple, you wonder why people haven't done it before. They get the parents and the victim in, they have all arrangements about reparation, they give these kids community work, up to 200 hours community work. It takes a bit of supervising, and it's really successful because it's done locally. And they say, look, there's no point waiting around for the government agencies because they've got huge workloads and they take forever and it costs the earth. So we're doing it ourselves with the backing of the police, because a kid knows that if they don't go along to this board, the police will send them off to the youth court, and they don't want to do that.
So is this the government continuing to roll back then?
Well, this is the community.
Or is this the community finally going, well, they've rolled back, we better fill the big gap that's been left?
Isn't the community making a better job of it than you?
Yeah, they are, and that's the kind of activity that we need to be pushing. Now, because they will inevitably want some money from the government to help them out.
So you're saying that the government became too paternalistic in the years gone by, and now it became too overbearing and involved in the community, and too
bureaucratic, and these communities have figured out that they can do it themselves. They've seen, these are people interested in youth, and they've seen all the strategies and the ministers and
or they've had their house robbed, and
then they've had their house robbed, and they're thinking, we can do this because those guys sitting in Wellington can't get right down into the grassroots and work with these kids. And as they said themselves, the parents come in, and the people on the board are the local school principal and the police and the neighbour from down the road, and there's a lot of shame involved. They don't like this. They can get it sorted out, and the same with the kids. And that can work, I think, particularly in our smaller places where people know each other. In some ways, it's the good old-fashioned neighbourhood reasserting itself and taking responsibility for sorting out its own young people. And it was an excellent project.
900 more policemen on the beat. I remember John Banks saying that. I think this government is promising 500 more.
No, that's us, John.
Oh, you're promising 500?
Yes.
But we're still short of policemen.
We are, and the big problem is going to be to keep the ones we've got. We've got some of the biggest city stations that are 70 or 80 police short, and this has accumulated over a while. You've got senior policemen leaving. So when you do a serious crime in a place like Auckland, you're likely to get a policeman with 1 or 2 years experience, because the guys with 15 years experience who really know how to deal with it have gone. So the big issue is going to be keeping the police we've got. There's a need for more, because one of the reasons they're leaving is the pressure on them. They get worn out, so they decide to leave, and that makes it worse for the rest of them.
Why haven't you come to terms with this 3 elections ago? Because I heard the same thing.
Well, the 900
being
more
parroted 3 elections ago,
and the 900 more were put in, but the level of violent crime continues to grow. The demand and the expectations on the police keep growing.
Just to change the subject entirely, I know we're running out of time, but Eric Roy, 26th on the list. Do you
he's
see
just
him?
Fine.
You think he's in again?
Oh yeah, yes he is.
And Sue Wood, how far up the ladder is she?
Oh, she's about 21 or something.
But what representation will we really have down here if things do go wrong for National and billing? Eric Roy's not there.
Oh, they won't go wrong, and Eric will be there. He knows what all the other list MPs and National know, that they build their credibility around the work they do in their electorate. And Eric has worked hard, been very consistent, always on the job. And
so
that's
he should
why
just accept that he
fine.
slips back a few places and.
Well, we've gone through change, bringing people in, and no one's argued about Eric's performance at all. It's just a matter of it works out. That's the way it works out when you bring some people in.
So he's not on the
to show that you've changed. No, he's not at all.
Well, with that recommendation. I'll thank you very much for coming along tonight, Bill. And Hunter and I, with a bit of luck, will be back with you next Wednesday between 8 and 9, Husband's Hour. You stay safe out there and think about what you're going to vote for and why. Good night.